The rattling of the stagecoach wheels over cracked desert earth was the only sound daring to disturb the morning stillness, and yet, even that faint clatter seemed swallowed by the oppressive heat of the high noon sun. Lydia Marlowe pressed her face into the brim of her weather-beaten hat, letting the sun scorch her skin as she tried to ignore the grit that clung to her like a second skin. Months without proper washing had left her skin dry, coated with the red dust of the New Mexico plains, and her hair hung in tangled strands. Stubbornly defying all attempts at neatness, she had been running for longer than she cared to admit. Her father, a gambler and mine speculator notorious for both his charm and his ruthlessness, had disappeared a year ago under suspicious circumstances. All that remained of him was a crumpled letter and a fountain of ink that had bled in the rain. Trust no one but the man with black hair and the scar on his left cheek. That single line had become her lifeline, her guide through towns that spat suspicion at strangers, and into the wilds where law existed only when convenient. The stagecoach groaned to a halt at the edge of Rattlesnake Gulch, a town that seemed to have been abandoned by everyone but the desperate. Wooden buildings leaned in strange angles, their faded paint peeling in the unrelenting sun. The town smelled of dust, leather, and smoke curling from chimneys that threatened to collapse at any moment. Lydia swung her leg over the stage, landing heavily on the cracked earth. Her boots sank slightly in the dry soil. She drew in a deep breath, tasting the bitter desert wind and the faint tang of sagebrush. A clerk in a small, dusty boarding house eyed her warily as she entered. "Looking for a room?" he asked, suspicion thick in his voice. Lydia nodded. She carried nothing but a worn leather satchel, but even that seemed to betray her, a stranger alone. Carrying secrets she couldn't risk sharing. She left her bag in the room, adjusting the strap across her shoulder, and headed straight for the saloon. Her instincts screamed caution. Months of running had taught her to trust no one, not even herself. The saloon doors swung as she entered, revealing a room of dim light, shaded corners, and lingering cigarette smoke. Patrons paused mid-drink, eyeing her carefully, and then she saw him, a tall, broad-shouldered man with long black hair streaked with dust, adorned with small tribal beads that jingled faintly as he moved. A scar ran jagged from the corner of his left eye to his jawline, catching the light in a way that made it almost glow. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over the room before settling on her. Something about his presence made the air itself seem to tense. He leaned casually against the bar, fingers tapping to a rhythm only he could hear, and smiled just enough to reveal a glimpse of amusement. "You're not from around here," he said, voice low and gravelly, carrying both amusement and warning. "Ain't many women wandering alone this far west without a reason." Lydia felt her pulse quicken. Her instinct screamed that he was dangerous, but she also sensed the faintest trace of protection in his gaze. "I'm looking for someone," she said carefully. "My father." She hesitated, realizing she could not risk revealing the letter or the truth behind her journey. He disappeared." The man's laugh was low, almost predatory. "In this town? That's a dangerous claim. You'd better watch your back, missy. Luck runs thin around these parts." He extended a hand, which Lydia did not take. "Name's Jackson Calloway. You'll either be grateful I showed up, or you won't live long enough to care." Before she could respond, the saloon doors banged open with a force that shook the room. 3 men on horseback kicked up dust in the street, guns leveled as they shouted, "There she is. Get her." Lydia's stomach plummeted. Her pursuers had tracked her all this way. She spun to flee, but Jackson's hand was already on her shoulder, strong and unyielding. In a blur of motion, he pulled her behind the bar, spinning his revolver with lethal grace. Bullets splintered wood around them, smoke curling into the hazy air, mingling with the scent of sweat and gunpowder. The firefight was over as suddenly as it began. The men fled, but the danger lingered like a shadow. Jackson's hand stayed on her shoulder, a firm anchor against the adrenaline that left her trembling. "You're lucky I was here," he muttered, voice low and almost intimate. For reasons Lydia couldn't fully explain, she did not push him away. He had the presence of a storm, dangerous, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. That evening, the desert wind howled outside the boarding house window as Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, her body still humming with residual fear. The scent of dust, sweat, and sunburn clung to her like a shroud. The door creaked open, and Jackson entered, brushing the dust from his long coat. He leaned against the frame, relaxed, yet every movement radiated control. "You survived your first day in Rattlesnake Gulch," he said, voice low, "and that's worth a drink." "I don't know you," Lydia said, still wary. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I like trouble," he said with a smirk, the corner of his scarred mouth twitching upward. "And your trouble, whether you like it or not." Lydia wanted to argue, wanted to retreat into the safety of solitude she had clung to for so long. But in his presence, she felt something she hadn't in months, a dangerous pull. A sense of trust she hadn't believed existed. Over the next few days, Lydia followed Jackson through the town's labyrinthine back alleys and abandoned shacks, learning the subtle rules that kept Rattlesnake Gulch alive. She observed how he could read the intentions of anyone in the room, how his hand never left the revolver at his hip, ready to strike with precision. She began to notice details she hadn't before: the small tribal beads in his hair, the calluses on his fingers, the faintest tremor in his voice when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, after a long day of gathering information about her father's disappearance, they rested in the shadows of a deserted alley. Lydia's hands were scraped, her body aching from the long ride and the fight earlier in the week. Jackson knelt beside her, carefully brushing dirt from her scraped elbows. "You don't realize it yet," he said softly, "but you're stronger than you think. And you're not alone anymore." The honesty in his voice, the raw strength of his presence, made Lydia swallow hard. For months she had survived alone, navigating danger with nothing but her wits. But now, in the dusty shadows of Rattlesnake Gulch, she felt the faintest spark of relief, perhaps even hope. And when she whispered, almost without thinking, "I haven't bathed in months," Jackson's laughter came low and warm, reverberating against the narrow walls of the alley. "Doesn't matter," he said, voice husky, pulling her into a rough, urgent kiss that left her breathless and aware of every nerve, ending in her body. The desert night carried the scent of sage and danger. But in that moment, Lydia felt an unfamiliar warmth. For the first time in months, the dust and grime seemed less important than the electricity between them. And as she clung to Jackson, feeling the strength of a man who had saved her more than once, she realized that the wild, lawless West had a strange, dangerous way of revealing the allies and perhaps the love that she had long believed lost. The desert wind howled outside, carrying the promise of more danger, more secrets, and more adventure. Lydia closed her eyes, knowing that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Lydia made her way toward the jagged canyon outside of Rattlesnake Gulch. Her boots scuffed the dry soil, raising tiny clouds that clung to her legs, the heat radiating off the rocks in waves. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush, sand, and something else she couldn't quite place, a faint tang of smoke from a distant fire, or perhaps danger lurking behind the cliffs. Jackson was already there, leaning against a jagged boulder, his long black hair catching the sunlight and glinting like dark silk threaded with beads. His eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon, as if he could see threats before they materialized. "You're late," he said, though there was no real accusation in his tone. His voice was low, calm, carrying the faint gravel of someone used to shouting over gunfire. "I stopped for water," Lydia replied, trying to sound casual despite her pounding heart. Her throat was dry, the dust and months without proper washing clinging to her skin, but she barely noticed it anymore. Survival had replaced vanity months ago. Jackson nodded once, then gestured toward a patch of sand near the edge of the canyon. "This is where your father ended up, or at least where someone wanted him to end up." He squatted, brushing his fingers across the sand, tracing the outline of a shallow depression. Lydia knelt beside him, peering at the markings in the dirt. She felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. "He was buried here?" she asked softly, voice barely audible over the whispering desert breeze. Jackson shook his head. "Not exactly. Someone wanted him to vanish without a trace. Whoever they were careful. But your father left clues if you know where to look." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal rod, digging gently into the sand. Lydia watched as he moved with the ease of someone who had done this before. Uncovering a partially buried metal box, her heart leapt. "That's it?" Jackson's fingers brushed hers as he lifted the box, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the dust storm blowing around them. "Maybe. Let's see what he left behind." They worked together to pry the box open. The contents spilled into the sand: letters, maps, and a handful of gold receipts, each one worn and faded, but legible enough to tell a story. Lydia picked up one of the letters, carefully unfolding it, the paper brittle under her fingers. "My dearest Lydia," she read aloud, her voice trembling despite her attempt to keep it steady. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone or in grave danger. Trust no one in Rattlesnake Gulch except the man with the black hair and scar you will meet soon. There are those who would kill to keep the gold hidden, and my mistakes have put you in danger. Follow the clues I leave. Find Jackson. He will help you survive." She looked up at him. "He knew you were out here?" Jackson nodded, sliding the box back into the sand. "Your father trusted me. I'm glad I was able to meet you before anyone else caught up." His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something unspoken, something dangerous that lingered in the set of his jaw. Lydia felt the pull of gratitude mixed with unease. She had spent months surviving alone, fighting to avoid death at every turn. And now, here was a man who had saved her once, who seemed to understand the threats better than anyone else. And yet, there was something about him that made her pulse quicken in ways she didn't expect. The desert was silent around them, save for the faint whistle of wind through the canyon walls. Then Jackson rose, brushing the dust from his hands. "We need to keep moving. The Vultures people who want your father's gold, they won't wait for us to uncover everything. They'll come looking." Lydia swallowed, gripping her satchel tightly. "I've been running for months. I can handle a few more." Jackson's laugh was low, almost affectionate, carrying the kind of weight that made her chest tighten. "I like your fire," he said, voice husky. "But don't fool yourself. You need me." Hours passed as they followed the canyon's twisting paths, uncovering hidden markings etched into rock and buried under centuries of sand. The air was heavy, the sun dipping low in the sky, painting the cliffs in streaks of orange and red. Lydia's legs ached, but she refused to stop. Every step brought her closer to her father's truth, and every glance at Jackson reminded her that she was no longer alone in the wilderness. As they settled for the night under a rocky overhang, the desert turning cold in the shade of twilight, Jackson tended to Lydia's minor scrapes from the day. He worked silently, careful, his fingers brushing dirt from her arms with an almost reverent touch. Lydia caught herself staring at him, noticing the curve of his scarred jaw, the strength in his hands, and the faint lines of a man who had fought and lost too many battles to count. "Why do you stay out here?" she asked finally, curiosity piercing through her fatigue. You could be anywhere safe, Rich, with no one trying to kill you." Jackson paused, leaning back against the rock, the beads in his hair clinking softly in the desert wind. "I've made too many enemies to hide anywhere. But I keep moving, keep surviving. And sometimes I find people worth protecting." His eyes met hers, dark and intense, and Lydia felt the words linger in the air. Unspoken yet heavy with meaning, the night stretched long, the wind whistling between the canyon walls, carrying the scent of sage and danger. Lydia tried to sleep but found her mind restless, thinking of her father, of the maps and letters, and of Jackson's closeness. When she finally allowed herself to relax, she felt the faintest touch of longing and emotion she hadn't acknowledged in months. "Lydia." Jackson's voice cut through the quiet, soft yet firm, and she turned to see him kneeling beside her. "You've survived this far because you're strong, smart, and fearless when you have to be. But don't forget danger doesn't wait. Neither should we." She nodded, swallowing back the lump in her throat. "I know, and I trust you, Jackson, even if I don't fully understand why." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then she whispered, almost instinctively, "I haven't bathed in months." Jackson's low laugh carried through the canyon, rough and warm, a sound that made her pulse quicken. "Doesn't matter," he said, voice husky. And before she could protest or retreat, he pulled her into a kiss that was rough, urgent, and electric, leaving her breathless. It was a kiss that carried the heat of the desert, the thrill of danger, and something far more primal than either of them had expected. When they broke apart, the canyon around them seemed quieter, almost respectful of the moment. Lydia felt a rush of emotions she couldn't name: relief, desire, gratitude, and a strange, dangerous sense of belonging. The desert wind rustled her hair, mingling the scent of dust with the lingering heat of Jackson's presence. "Tomorrow," Jackson said finally, standing and dusting off his coat, "we follow the next clue. Your father's secrets are layered, and the closer we get, the more dangerous it will become." Lydia nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had spent months alone, surviving on instinct and grit. Now, with Jackson by her side, she felt stronger, more capable, yet keenly aware that danger waited in every shadow. They settled for the night, the stars stretching overhead in a wide desert sky, brilliant and unforgiving. Lydia lay awake for hours, listening to the whispers of the canyon wind, her mind replaying every touch, every glance, every moment of the day. And somewhere in the depth of her thoughts, she realized that she was no longer running just to survive. She was running to uncover the truth and perhaps, unknowingly, to find something she had not allowed herself to hope for in months: connection, trust, and a sense of home beside a man who had become more than an ally in the dust and danger of the Old West dot by the first light of dawn. Lydia was ready. The canyon awaited, secrets buried in sand and stone waiting to be revealed. And as she followed Jackson into the deep shadows of the rocks, she understood that the journey ahead would test every ounce of courage, every shred of intelligence, and every pulse of her heart. The desert had a way of stripping a person bare, of exposing weaknesses, fears, and desires. And for the first time, Lydia was ready to confront all of it with Jackson at her side. Rattlesnake Gulch had changed since Lydia and Jackson returned from the canyon. The streets, once quiet and abandoned, now buzzed with murmurs and cautious glances. Rumors of a woman traveling alone with a mysterious man had spread, and the townsfolk kept their distance, fearful of the trouble that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Lydia could feel it in the air, the weight of suspicion, the tension of anticipation, and the faint, underlying scent of danger that clung to every shadowed alley and sun-bleached building. Jackson moved like a predator through the streets, eyes scanning every doorway, every shuttered window. His long black hair, streaked with dust and decorated with beads, caught the sunlight as he passed, his scar glinting faintly, a warning to anyone foolish enough to cross him. Lydia followed closely, keeping her hand on the satchel that held the letters, maps and gold receipts they had retrieved from the canyon. Each item was a piece of a puzzle that had swallowed her father and now threatened to consume them both. "This town feels different," Lydia said softly, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind that stirred the dust at their boots. "Like it's waiting for something to happen." Jackson's gaze swept the main street and his jaw tightened. "It is. People are watching. And those who want your father's gold aren't patient. They'll make their move soon." They ducked into a narrow alley, shaded from the sun. The walls of the buildings loomed over them, cracked and faded, the paint peeling like sunburned skin. Lydia could feel the heat radiating from the stones, and the faint scent of rot and dust filled the air. She adjusted the strap of her satchel nervously, her heart pounding in anticipation of the unknown. Jackson crouched beside a barrel, pulling a folded map from his coat. "These letters and receipts tell part of the story, but the rest is buried in the old mines outside town. That's where your father hid what he couldn't carry, what he couldn't spend." He traced a route with his finger, his touch brushing hers briefly. The contact sent a shiver up her spine, a spark she could no longer ignore. They spent the day moving through the town, questioning old miners, barkeepers, and anyone who might remember Lydia's father. Each person seemed wary, eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. Some refused to speak, while others offered cryptic warnings. "Don't dig where you don't belong," one old man rasped, leaning on a cane, his voice trembling. "Men have died for less than that gold." Lydia swallowed hard, but Jackson's steady presence gave her courage. "We'll be careful," he said, eyes dark with intensity. "But we have to find the truth, Lydia. He trusted us with it. And that's not something we can ignore." As the sun dipped low, painting the town in streaks of gold and crimson, Lydia felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. Her muscles ached from the long hours of walking, questioning, and watching. Dust clung stubbornly to her skin, yet she barely noticed anymore. Survival had long ago replaced comfort, and the thrill of uncovering her father's secrets pushed her onward, but danger was never far. That evening, as they returned to the boarding house, Lydia felt a prickle of unease along the back of her neck. The shadows of the street seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. Then, without warning, 3 masked men appeared from the alley opposite, blocking their path. Guns were leveled, and Lydia froze, her pulse hammering in her chest. "Step aside," one of them hissed. "Hand over the papers, and maybe we let you walk away." Jackson moved first, stepping in front of her, his presence a barrier and a warning. "You want to try that?" His voice was calm, but every muscle in his body radiated lethal intent. The men laughed, but the sound died quickly as Jackson drew his revolver in a fluid motion, spinning it with the practiced grace of a man who had survived too many battles. Bullets cracked through the wooden storefronts, splintering signs and sending dust into the air. Lydia ducked instinctively behind a barrel, heart pounding, watching Jackson move like a shadow through the chaos. When the smoke cleared, the masked men had fled, leaving the street littered with spent casings and the sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder. Lydia's hand shook, but Jackson's steady grip on her arm grounded her. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice low, concern threading through the rough edge. She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. I think so." Jackson studied her for a moment, eyes darkening with an unspoken intensity. "You're stronger than I thought," he said quietly, "and braver than most men I've met." For the first time in months, Lydia allowed herself to feel the weight of everything they had endured, the running, the danger, the uncertainty. She had survived on her own, and now she realized she was capable of far more than she had believed. And in Jackson's presence, she felt something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for: connection, trust, maybe even love. That night, they sat in the quiet of the boarding house, the room lit only by a flickering lantern. Jackson cleaned his revolver with meticulous care, the beads in his hair clinking softly with every motion. Lydia watched him, noticing the concentration etched on his face, the precision with which he moved. She felt the pull of desire and gratitude, mingling with the lingering adrenaline of the day's encounter. "You know," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I never expected to survive this long. Not after everything. Not after losing him." Her voice faltered and she swallowed hard. "But I made it, and you've helped me more than anyone else ever could." Jackson's eyes softened and he leaned back, letting the gun rest across his knees. "You've helped yourself, Lydia. I just made sure the rest of the world didn't get a chance to stop you." The honesty in his words struck her. She had spent months alone, trusting no one, guarding herself against betrayal. And yet, here was a man who had risked everything for her. A man who seemed to understand the desert, the danger, and her pain. For a long moment, they sat in silence, listening to the faint creak of the wooden floorboards and the desert wind outside. Then, almost instinctively, Lydia leaned closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I haven't bathed in months," she whispered, a hint of self-conscious humor in her voice. Jackson laughed, a low, warm sound that made her chest flutter despite the tension still clinging to the room. "Doesn't matter," he said, voice husky. And before she could react, he pulled her into a kiss that was rough, urgent, and filled with the heat of the day. The thrill of danger and something far more intimate than either had expected. When they broke apart, the quiet of the boarding house felt different, warmer, safer, as if the moment had carved out a small pocket of peace in a world that was otherwise relentless and unforgiving. Lydia felt a surge of emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months: hope, relief, desire, and the faintest trace of belonging. The next morning, Jackson rose before dawn, the first light of the desert sun painting the room in pale gold. He moved with careful precision, packing his coat and checking their gear. Lydia watched him, noting the way his hands worked, strong and steady, and the determination in his dark eyes. "We follow the mine trail today," he said, voice calm but commanding. "Your father's secrets are deeper than we thought, and the closer we get, the more dangerous it will become. The vultures won't give up easily." Lydia nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had spent months surviving alone, trusting no one. And now she realized she was ready to face whatever came next, with Jackson by her side. As they left the boarding house and stepped into the early morning light, the town of Rattlesnake Gulch seemed both smaller and larger at the same time. The buildings leaned, the streets were cracked, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, but Lydia no longer felt entirely alone. The desert had stripped her bare, revealing every fear and every desire, but it had also given her strength. And with Jackson walking beside her, she felt a determination she had never known. The journey ahead would be dangerous, filled with hidden threats, deadly adversaries, and secrets that could destroy them both. But Lydia had survived months in the unforgiving desert, and she would survive this too, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she realized she was beginning to care not just about the mission, but about the man who had become her protector, her ally, and perhaps her only tether to something worth holding on to in a world defined by danger and dust. The air smelled of dry earth and gunpowder as Lydia and Jackson approached the entrance to the abandoned gold mine. The canyon walls loomed over them, jagged and unforgiving, shadows stretching across the desert floor like dark fingers. Lydia's hands were clammy, her satchel heavy with the letters, maps, and receipts that had guided them this far. Her pulse raced, equal parts anticipation and dread. Somewhere inside, she feared that this would be the moment everything could fall apart, the moment the Black Vultures, the ruthless gang who had pursued her father's gold, might finally catch up to them. Jackson moved ahead, silent and purposeful, long black hair tied back loosely, beads glinting faintly in the morning sun. His revolver hung at his hip, ready, and his eyes scanned the mine entrance like a predator marking territory. Lydia followed closely, her every step measured, trying to match his confidence despite the fear twisting in her stomach. "This is it," Jackson said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "Your father's secrets are inside, but if they're here, we'll know soon enough. Stay close." Lydia nodded, her throat tight. She had been running, hiding, and fighting for months, and yet she had never felt the raw intensity of anticipation that surged now. The mine was dark, the air heavy with dust and decay, and the faint scent of rusted metal and damp stone filled her lungs. Each step echoed in the tunnels, the sound amplified by the hollow spaces beneath the desert cliffs. They moved deeper into the mine, following the faint markings on the walls that her father had left behind. Letters, maps, and receipts told part of the story, but it was clear there was more gold, more betrayal, more danger than Lydia had imagined. As they rounded a corner, a faint noise made her freeze, the scrape of boots over stone. Deliberate and stealthy. "They're here," Jackson whispered, his hand brushing hers for a fraction of a second, grounding her. "The vultures found us." Lydia's heart raced, but she drew a deep breath. "Then we end this now." They advanced cautiously, entering a large chamber deep inside the mine. Wooden supports creaked ominously under the weight of centuries, and shadows danced across the walls, flickering with the glow of Jackson's lantern. And then they saw them, 5 men, armed and masked, guarding a wooden crate that radiated importance even from a distance. Lydia recognized the desperation in their stance, the hunger for gold, for power, for control over something that had caused so much death. Jackson stepped forward, revolver raised. "Step aside or you'll regret it," he warned, voice low and dangerous. The men laughed, but it died quickly as Lydia moved beside him, hands gripping a revolver of her own. She had learned to shoot, to defend herself, to fight back, and she was ready. The standoff was brief but intense. Bullets cracked against the walls, splintering wood and sending clouds of dust into the air. Lydia fired twice, hitting a man in the shoulder, forcing him to retreat. Jackson moved like a shadow, fast and precise, disarming one man and forcing another to flee into a side tunnel that quickly became blocked by falling debris. The mine echoed with shouts, gunfire, and the acrid scent of gunpowder, but Lydia and Jackson remained calm, synchronized in their movements. A lethal pair against the greed-driven men before them. When the final man attempted to seize the crate, Jackson's revolver barked, the shot precise. The man fell, clutching the wood, and the remaining adversaries fled, leaving the mine echoing with silence and the faint groan of the wooden supports. Lydia's hand shook, but Jackson placed a steadying grip on her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he asked, eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," she said, though her heart still raced. "We did it." Jackson smiled faintly, a brief glimmer of relief passing across his scarred face. "For now. But this isn't over until we get the truth out, until your father's name is cleared and the gold is safe." Together, they approached the crate, opening it carefully. Inside were stacks of gold bars, more than Lydia had imagined possible, along with letters that detailed her father's dealings, the debts, the threats, the men who had wanted him dead, and the careful measures he had taken to hide what mattered most. Lydia read through the documents, tears pricking her eyes as she understood the scope of her father's actions and the danger he had placed her in. "This explains everything," she whispered. "The threats, the running, the danger." Jackson placed a hand over hers, brushing a strand of dust-streaked hair from her face. "And now you can finish it. The world knows what he did, and we survived. That's all that matters." For the first time in months, Lydia allowed herself to breathe fully. The fear and tension that had shadowed every step seemed to lift, replaced with a sense of accomplishment, of justice, and of survival. And yet, beneath it all, there was the undeniable pull of something more. She looked at Jackson, long black hair falling over his shoulders, scar catching the lantern light, eyes dark and unwavering. In that moment, she realized she was no longer thinking only of survival, she was thinking of him. Jackson leaned closer, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "You've grown stronger than I imagined. Not just in fighting, but in everything. You're remarkable, Lydia." Her chest tightened. "I wouldn't have made it without you." He smiled faintly, but there was something in his expression that made her heart flutter. "And you won't have to ever be alone again. Not if you don't want to be." The air between them grew thick with unspoken emotion. Months of running, fighting, and surviving together had forged a bond neither could deny. Lydia swallowed, nerves buzzing with a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and desire. "I don't think I want to be," she admitted softly. Jackson's hand brushed her cheek, rough and calloused, and he pulled her into a kiss that was tender yet urgent, conveying everything that words could not. Dust clung to their clothes, the scent of sweat and gunpowder lingering, but neither seemed to care. In that embrace, all the months of danger, uncertainty, and grief melted away, leaving only them, raw and unguarded. Standing in the heart of the desert, when they finally broke apart, the mine was silent again, the threat gone, the gold secure, and her father's legacy protected. Lydia felt a sense of closure she had not known she needed. The desert outside the mine stretched endless, sun catching on the rocks and casting long shadows that seemed to bow in respect. Jackson held her hand as they left the mine, walking side by side toward the town. "We've done it," he said quietly. "No one can touch the gold now, and your father's secrets are safe." Lydia nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's finally over." Back in Rattlesnake Gulch, the townspeople whispered in awe as Lydia and Jackson passed. The threat of the black vultures gone, the mystery of the gold finally resolved. For the first time in months, Lydia felt the desert wind not as an enemy, but as a companion, carrying away the dust, the fear, and the memories of months spent running for her life. That night, under the wide expanse of desert stars, Lydia and Jackson sat outside the boarding house, the warm glow of a lantern between them. The desert was quiet, peaceful, and endless. And for the first time, Lydia allowed herself to hope for a future that wasn't defined by survival or fear. Jackson's fingers intertwined with hers, the rough texture of his hands grounding her in the moment. "You've come so far," he said softly. "And now, maybe you can finally rest." Lydia leaned her head on his shoulder, listening to the wind whispering through the canyon and the faint creak of the boarding house above. "I think I can," she whispered, "and I think I want to stay, not just here, but with you." He pressed a kiss to her hair, long and dark, tangled with dust and beads, and held her close. "Then we stay," he said, "together." The desert stretched before them, silent and infinite, carrying away the echoes of gunfire, danger, and fear. Lydia felt the warmth of Jackson's hand in hers, the steady beat of his heart, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe in something lasting: love, safety, and the promise of a new beginning. In Rattlesnake Gulch, their story would be remembered not just for the danger and the gold, but for the courage, trust, and bond forged in the desert. Lydia's father's secrets were revealed, the black vultures defeated, and the two of them stood together, triumphant, free. And finally home got as the night deepened. Stars glittering like fragments of glass above, Lydia whispered softly, "Thank you for everything." Jackson smiled, brushing a strand of her dust-streaked hair from her face. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you for trusting me." And as the desert wind carried the scent of sage and freedom across the canyon, Lydia and Jackson sat together, holding hands, their hearts beating in unison, knowing that the past was behind them and the future, vast and untamed, lay ahead.